Hello.
We have had a request from multiple people that we put the Sphere Omer on hold. We have 4 or 5 weeks before Pesach with Sphere Omer. We could always go back to that and we could try to finish the halachos of COVID because it's still Nogea. Yeah, it's the Tzurba M'Rabanan special volume halachos of COVID. I've ordered volume 7, which is Hilchos Nida, which is uh, the last sefer of Yoredeya. Mirz Hashem, those who finished will get a certificate that they completed Yoredeya at the end of that volume. So tonight we'll start on page 29 of the new volume, Halachic Perspectives on Danger in COVID-19. Those of you who've looked at the index of this new volume, it's very halacha l'maisa regarding minyan, kriyas Torah, masks, laws related to Zoom, what you can do, what you can't do with Zoom, and many other very interesting issues. So what to do when plague strikes? We will quote the Ramon Yoredeya in Siman 116, halachos of sakana, which were discussed. We did do a little bit of this in volume 6. The Ramah presents a general warning to avoid dangerous activities or places and proceeds to offer a number of examples, including our situation of Dever. Says the Ramah, person should stay away from anything that leads to danger. So for example, this Ramah might be relevant to jumping out of an airplane, doing skydiving. You know, a person should be cautious about things that lead to sakana. You certainly shouldn't put yourself in a situation of sakana. Ki sakanta chamirim yisura. Sakana is worse than isur. Yesh lachosh yoter l'sofik sakana l'sofik isur. You have to be more concerned about the possibility of danger versus the possibility of isur. You got to be more stringent on yourself regarding that. So first, the Ramah says you have to run away if a plague happens in the city. You should try to get out right away. Not at the end. Somebody who is someone who guards his shawl should, stay away from sakana. According to the Ramah, who's actually quoting from the Tshuva of the Maril was an early Rishon who paskined for the Bnei Ashkenaz. The proper response to the presence of an epidemic in one city is to flee due to the danger. The simplest reason for fleeing is that it is dangerous to remain due to a significant chance that one will become infected with the disease. Best manner of avoiding it is to flee. The Maril gives 2 additional reasons for fleeing. If there's a heavenly decree against a certain location, so if you flee elsewhere, you can escape the divine decree. The second is that those who remain may panic, which panic is also dangerous. The Kaf HaChaim adds that fleeing is the proper course of action because Dever is highly contagious. He notes that the Arizal, so the Arizal was writing in the early 1500s in Sfat, already cautioned against even handling the belongings of clothing of one who is ill could infect the person. And these are relevant for preventing the spread of coronavirus. Remember, Louis Pasteur in 1870 was the scientist who began to explain the concept of infectious disease, where they proved that TB was caused by an infectious agent. So you have the Ari 300 years before that already stating, without really knowing the germ theory of disease, that you shouldn't touch clothing and other items that a sick person touched. I think that's very interesting. Kaf HaChaim says, "Sheyesh livroch ben ha'ir kishedever ba ba'ir, lefishu choili hamitzbadek." This is an infectious disease. K'moshe kosav yidbak Hashem b'chas ha'dever. In the Tochacha, where Hashem says, "I'm going to afflict you with dever," it's yidbak. Yidbak means it's to stick. Devek means glue. The neighborhood where the person who is sick, or a certain kli or clothing, again, the Kaf HaChaim lived in the 1800s, so he was already now beginning to become aware. He was in Baghdad, but there was probably scientific knowledge at that point of the true nature of infectious disease. But he says the way it was written, Bishar Kavanos by the Ari, almost 300 years before. So this instruction to flee was a logical one during earlier times in history. The problem is that this appears to conflict with the passage in the Gemara in Baba Kama, that when one enters when Dever enters in one city, you should remain at home. It says in Baba Kama, Ton Rabbanan, Dever be'ir kares raglecha. Gather up your feet and stay at home. Shenemar, ve'atem lo tetzu ish mi Pesach beiso ad boker. Right, the night of Pesach, when the mashchis was around, people were told to stay indoors. V'oimer ki lecha ami ba b'chadarecha. You, my people, stay in your homes. Uskord lasecha, close your doors. V'oimer michutz tishakal cherev v'mechadarim ema. This is again part of the Tochacha, where outside you're going to have the sword, and inside there will be fear. Now, why did you need all these extra psukim? Asks the Gemara. Ma'va oimer, because the pasuk about Pesach is really referencing night. Maybe be a mama low, but maybe there's not a problem in the daytime. Toshma. That happens in the daytime. If there's a plague in the city, a person should not walk in the middle of the street. Baal Chamavis has obviously been given reshus to kill, so the Baal Chamavis walks openly in the street. Shalom be'ir ayalech b'tzadei drachim. If it's peace in the city, no problem, then you shouldn't walk on the sides of the road. Since the Malach HaMavis doesn't have reshus, he hides. He probably hangs out on the sides of the road. Then you can walk in the middle of the road. So according to the Gemara, it seems that the appropriate response to an epidemic is not to venture outside, both at night and during the day. In addition, if one does need to be outside, one should not walk on the main thoroughfares. So how does this correlated, how does it reconcile with what the Maril and the Ramah said, that you should flee the city? So one response is that one must evaluate the medical reality of every situation based on the facts on the ground, and not just based on the comments of the Gemara, as every situation may be different. Chazal's primary goal was to offer us spiritual guidance and inspiration. If at times we see that the medically or scientific advice of the doctors differ, one should follow the advice given at that time, the medical advice. Like it says on the bottom, the Otzar Gaonim says when Rav Shri Gaon states that Chazal were our sages, not our doctors. So what Rav Shri Gaon is pointing to is that if the doctors tell you something, you're supposed to listen to them, because Chazal don't play the role of doctors. They play the role of Chachamim. They give us spiritual advice, etc. Thus, if it was accepted in the time of the Ramah that the safest medical method of avoiding an epidemic was to flee, then that was the correct approach at that time. The time of the Gemara, it may have been different. Now, aside from that consideration, the commentaries in fact address this question. The Marsha tries to reconcile the Gemara and the Ramah, suggests that indeed it is preferable to flee, but so long as one does not flee, you should remain in one's home. right? The Maharsha says, near a lomar, the lo bar lomar lafuki shelo yufazer raglav. When the Ramah said to flee, it doesn't mean that he didn't say to stay home. The Avshalomer came. It means first you should get out of the city. If you can't pick up your feet and run, so the Maharsha says, if you have a chance to flee, flee. And if you couldn't flee, we'll see in our situation in COVID, there is no place to flee. So the recommendation of staying at home was right on. The Maril also holds that it's preferable to flee, but he explains that the Gemara refers to a case where one did not flee at the onset of the epidemic. In a case where the epidemic has taken hold across the city, it's preferable to remain at home, as venturing outside may prove to be more dangerous, as one may likely contract the illness this way. Says the Maril that the Ramah quoted, the Gemara would say you have to flee. That if you could not flee and the devil has taken a hold, you should go inside. If you can flee in the beginning, it's better to flee, which was also the basis for the Ramah that you should flee. Thus, it seems like many authorities hold that if possible, it's preferable to flee the city entirely. But if that is not possible, one is not left yet, it's best not to leave one's home. It's interesting to note that the Ramah himself fled his hometown of Krakow during the spread of an epidemic there to take refuge in a small town in the Polish countryside. The Ramah mentions that in his introduction to his commentary on Megillus Esther, known as Bechir Yain, which he wrote to his father in place of Mishloach Manos because he lacked the resources to send food or organize a Purim Suda. Says the Ramah in the Mechir Yain, Ani Moshe Isser Lishmi Krakow. I was part of the exile when we fled our city, because it was thick atmosphere, which is an epidemic. They lived in a small place, Shidlov. It was no fig or grape, no water. We couldn't be Makayim Purim, to remove whatever trouble we were in. I said to myself, you know what, I'm going to make myself happy by writing a tshuva. So in explaining why he's writing this little shot on the Megillah, he's saying, because he doesn't have food to send Mishloach Manos, because of the epidemic, and they were exiled to a different city. Kaf HaChaim offers another reason as to why one should attempt to flee at the beginning of an epidemic and not wait until it has spread. Ki az lo yichal livrach min ha'ir, ki lo yitem lo makom menucha. Ki gam oav v'rav mineged nago yamdu v'krov v'yachiku. His loved ones, his friends will stand opposite him, and his relatives will distance themselves. No one want him to have to stay with them. Means if everyone knows he's coming from a city that's full of devil, they won't accept him. So go right away, because that way at least you have a higher chance of being accepted. According to Kaf HaChaim, if one waits too long, one may not be able to leave, since even his friends and relatives will be too fearful to take him in. We saw this with the closing of borders in many countries across the world. So how do these guidelines that we have learned so far apply to our current epidemic of the coronavirus? So clearly one must evaluate the situation based on the recommendations of the health professionals and not just based on the rulings in the Gemara and the Ramah. Nevertheless, one can easily extrapolate some general principles. First, since our pandemic has spread worldwide, even if one would argue that it qualifies as exactly the same high level of danger as the Dever, there's no point in fleeing, since traveling itself may be dangerous, exactly as the Marul and Ramah explained. However, the Gemara's advice of remaining at home appears to be exactly on target in our current circumstances and coincides perfectly with the recommendations of the health professionals and orders of the government. It would also seem apparent from these rulings that one is not obligated to daven in a shul with the minyan during such times. If the Achronim ruled that it was dangerous to exit one's home during a dever, and one should flee the city completely, then certainly they did not expect one to daven with the minyan, and they likely discouraged it as well, if it's considered a health hazard to do so. This too coincides well with the instructions given by health experts and Rabbanim in many places during various times over the past year, not to leave one's home to attend shul. One example of such a ruling was given in mid-March 2020 by the Rabbinical Council of Bergen County, where they instructed all the shuls to close. It is clear from the letter written that they were concerned with the possibility that continued community infection might cause the hospitals to be overloaded and be able to treat dangerously ill patients. This decision was, of course, temporarily adopted in nearly every Jewish community in the world at some point. Another important precedent for halachic responses to epidemics can be found in the writings of Rabbi Akiva Eger, who offered a detailed list of instructions, both religious and medical, for responding to the cholera epidemic of 1831. Michtav binyan magefa cholera, Rachmana litzlan, l'manyedu lisnag v'itim kashim ala. How should you behave? Katvu igiani ktavo igiani binyan tefillah beit hakneset. First, he had gotten a letter from someone who asked him about davening. L'dati ze emet shakibutz b'mokum tsar eino nachon. He says gathering in small places is not correct. Aval efshar lispalo kitot. You should daven in smaller groups. V'chol pam b'msei ma'ad, as small as possible. Erech tesvav anashim, 15 people. V'yaschilu ka'ora boker, start early morning. V'achrei kasachas, stagger it. Instead of having 100 people in shul, you do many minyonims back to back. And each person should be told exactly when they should come to daven. You should daven for the king. You should also say the Parshas Haktoros. It seems to be a school against the dever.
Cholera, is that a bacterial infection? Is it the same thing like, or is it a sanitational type of problem?
No,
what was the cholera?
Cholera is an infectious disease. Is bacteria.
It's bacterial.
Yeah, and you get it from dirty water when the sanitation would overflow and it would enter the drinking supply. That's how it was spread.
So most of these epidemics that they had at that time were bacterial, which means you could flee from that and go to a cleaner place, a safer place. It's a little bit different than what we have now. You know what I mean?
It's different, Jerry.
No, cholera still exists in Africa where I grew up. Cholera is still prevalent.
No, but Jerry was saying,
yeah, but it's a different epidemic. It's a sanitational epidemic. You could escape from it and you could survive it.
But Jerry, they said, remember, since COVID spread everywhere, where are you going to flee to?
Right, but on cholera you could flee. So therefore, on the epidemic, if we had this virus 200 years ago, they wouldn't tell you to flee. They would tell you to stay. You know what I mean? In the house. It's different than the cholera epidemic. Cholera epidemic, you run away, and that's it. Get out of that area.
Go to a cleaner area. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's it. Here's what I'm saying. I'm saying the epidemics then are different than what it is now. They're totally different.
Each epidemic has to be evaluated for exactly what it is. Is it viral? Is it bacterial? How does it spread? Absolutely. That's why they said you don't base it on the Ramah, the Gemara. You base it on what the health professionals evaluate how the disease is spreading. And for example, Jerry, you were old enough to remember in the 1950s, the polio scare. There, people didn't go to swimming. They didn't go to swimming pools. They didn't go to movie theaters. They also didn't gather. They weren't exactly sure, but polio is also transmitted in the water. So people, they closed the swimming pools. People didn't go swimming for a few years until the vaccine came out. back to the Rabbi Kiva Eger. People should not push to enter the shul. He was also suggesting that somebody from the police should stand there. Means once the synagogue had too many people, he even recommended that the police come to keep people out. You should not be sad. Don't walk at night in the atmosphere, but you should walk when the sun is shining. Walk on the meadow. To get fresh air. This is 1830. That the windows should open and a good circulation should come in. Rabbi Kiva Eger lived in Posen. They focused their heart on Hashem. They did tshuva, lidfak al pisach Hashem, betfilos tachanunim. L'spal gam al Adonenu melech adir, Hashem yarim hodov al zaro, v'sarav adavachon Hashem midinasol, harbos b'tzakam salavim isa. So Rabbi Kiva Eger, you should daven, you should do tshuva, you should pray for the king, you have tzedakah, you do spiritual things as well. They should eat and drink cautiously, what the doctors say they should do. The doctors, what they say to stay away from what you should not eat or drink. You should stay away from them as if they were treif. You shouldn't not listen to the doctors. Other health things. You shouldn't go in the morning with an empty stomach. You should drink something hot before. Listen to Rabbi Kiva Eger now. Whoever doesn't listen to the command of the doctors is sinning greatly to Hashem. I mean, it's amazing. Rabbi Kiva Eger is 200 years ago. There's no one greater than Rabbi Kiva Eger. He's considered certainly one of the greatest achronim. And he tells you very clearly that you should listen to what the doctors say. Because remember, there's been debates in Israel. You don't listen to the Rabbanim. All they've got to do is read this Rabbi Kiva Eger. It's very powerful. Rabbi Kiva Eger enumerates medical instructions that were thought to be helpful in preventing cholera, such as eating habits and getting fresh air, together with forceful words stressing the importance of following the doctor's instructions. This should give us clear precedent of the significance given to medical instructions by great poskim, even if some of the details may not be relevant today. In addition, his religious suggestions of the types of tefillah to add or stress, giving tzedakah, davening for the government, and all the citizens affected by the epidemic can certainly serve as a precedent for our situation. Finally, Rabbi Kiva Eger's suggestion of establishing minyanim limited to 15 people, using police to enforce it if necessary, is an important precedent for today, to be as opposed to the regular schedule of minyanim. Now, what if it is not one's time to die? A number of commentaries raise the question of why one must take protective measures at all during a time of an epidemic. After all, doesn't Hashem decree on Rosh Hashanah whether a person will live or die during the coming year? If one is destined to live, then it should not matter whether one places oneself in harm's way or engages in actions that could affect other people. If they are supposed to live, then Hashem will protect them. The Rashbash wrote an important and lengthy tshuva on this subject. It's referenced by the Pischei Tshuva in Yoredeya and explains that things are not always so simple. She'ela. Hanisabi made dever mimakom lamakom. Somebody is fleeing from an epidemic. Im to'ila adam olo. Is that going to help the person? She'im nichtav Rosh Hashanah lemisa, ma to'elna anisa. If that Rosh Hashanah, this person was given a decree of death, then if he flees, maybe it won't help. And the nichtav l'chaim lo tezkenu ha'amida. And if he was written in the book of life, then staying in where he is shouldn't harm him. What was the Rashbash's answer? Everybody has a set amount of time to live. I will fill the number of your days. I will add to your days. God informed him of when he would pass away. Uvedivrei Rabbeinu Zal, beperek ein ben amuder, kiven shigir kitzur shalom akol moshvim bo. Once a person reaches his time where he's supposed to leave the world, so everyone rules over him. Al ken ani omer lefi kotzer sichli. So the Rashbash says, according to my intellect, mi she'ein biyado aveira mechayeves mitzvah. Somebody who doesn't have in his hand an aveira that would give you the death penalty, the kotzer yomim, mea okar, or shortening of his days, like Kores. Nishar ala ketza kotzer v'spar yimei chaya. So he will remain with the fixed days that has been given to him when he was born. Hashem is goizer, how long he's supposed to live. He'll remain there, as long as he doesn't shorten it with averos. Uva Rosh Hashanah eino nidin lo b'chaim v'lo b'maves. He says that on Rosh Hashanah you're not necessarily judged for life or death. Aval nishar la ketza kotzu. What it says, he will remain with whatever length of time he was given initially. Uvetum kitzu yomus. And what is decreed is that he will die when he's supposed to die, that was based on the decree that was given when he was born. Now that could change, because let's say he was very good in the midst of Kibud Avayim. It says, Laman yarichu yamecha. So if you were born with a set time of 90 years, but you did a lot of mitzvahs for Arichas Yomim, says the Rashbash, the time that you were given could be added, not just subtracted. V'zui misa b'lo chet. This explains why people die even though they're not sinners, because they were given a set amount of time to live, and Hashem fills that. That in which we don't really get a decree of life and death on Rosh Hashanah, he says, Nemer b'toira, pen yamut b'milchama. Right? There is the Kohen Gadol has to go out and instruct Klal Yisrael when they go out to battle that whoever, is married in his first year of life should go back home. Because it says, Pen yamut b'milchama, he might die and then he leaves his wife a widow. So she'im nichtav Rosh Hashanah b'chaim u'b'maves, because if he was written Rosh Hashanah to life or death, eina b'choka efshar, avu b'choka chiyuv. So that's not just a possibility, that would be in the realm of absolute, it had to happen. She'im nichtav she'yamut b'cherev. If it had been decreed Rosh Hashanah that he's going to die by a sword, afilu b'toch beito, or yisater b'mistroim yidkar b'cherev, so he might be stabbed even at home. Aval bala ketza kotzu, someone who's been given a set time to live, eino nichnas b'din achayva me'amas b'yom Rosh Hashanah. He doesn't necessarily have a specific din of life or death from Rosh Hashanah. Nichnas le'inyan sha'ar inyan adam. What is judged in Rosh Hashanah is b'ni. Does he going to have children? Mezoini, parnasa, brius, health, choili, sickness. So
I guess the person who wrote Natana Soike didn't have the same opinion.
Well, but you see, what's going on is he's saying that it is judged on Rosh Hashanah whether you will fill that case or not. He said that we're given a certain amalei. Hashem is going to fulfill our lives.
Yeah, but he doesn't. He says you're not done to l'chaim or l'misa. He says you're not done there. That's what he says specifically. I mean, that's not.
He says as long as he doesn't have avera mechayeves mitzvah, as long as he has not been. For example, Rosh Hashanah, a cheshbon is made. Maybe you have an avera that gives you misa. So there are things that could happen in Rosh Hashanah that would lead to that. If they make a cheshbon that you have an avera mechayeves misa. So he says, as long as someone doesn't have an avera mechayeves misa, then he will be mishar ala ketzar kotzuv mispar yimei chayav. That's what he means. He's going to remain ala ketzar kotzuv as long as he doesn't have either a mitzvah that's going to shorten his life, or he might be done on Rosh Hashanah that a mitzvah to lengthen his life. They all of a sudden he did a huge kibbud avayim, or he did shiluach hakein, where there's a din of arichos yomim. Yes, I agree. It's not exactly the way we've been taught, but there are serious aspects. Are you going to get sick? What's your parnasa? So let's go further. He still says it's a possibility that he may die from a plague over misas melchama v'domeim, or misas tivis al yedei roya hanaga, or a natural death because he goes out in a tornado not wearing any clothes and he gets a pneumonia. Some die without judgment. He was a Michigan. He jumped off the Empire State Building. So, so some things are going to happen to him no matter what. Meaning, in one of the davenings, Rosh Hashanah, we say, Ezo b'cherev, v'alam dinos bo yeyomer. On this and this country, there's going to be a war. So you might get caught up in a war. That's what he means here. That he could have there could be a natural disaster, and you're swept up in it. The Miriam Magdala, either Miriam Magdalene, Nasi, or Miriam Makri Dardaki. One was the braider of hair, the other taught children. The Gemara says the Malach HaMavis he mistakenly killed the wrong Miriam. So you see, somebody could die, and it's not through mishpat; it's through a mistake or something like that. How about this? If we said Rosh Hashanah, it is declared whether a person is going to be healthy or sick. Now, let's say in Pashu Ba'atzman, if they were negligent, like we said, he went outdoors, not dressed properly on a cold day, Yavoli Dechoili. He's going to bring himself onto a sickness. Person should stay away from danger. Person decides to jump out of an airplane and his parachute doesn't open. So that's
where did we ever hear that the Malach HaMavis makes a mistake?
That's the Gemara in Chagiga.
Yeah, but it's a very big. I know, but it's a very big chidush that HaKadosh Baruch Hu obviously is running the world. So to say that there could be a mistake between two people with the same, it's crazy. Just very.
But remember, the Malach HaMavis is a shaliach. Shaliach can make a mistake. It's not a HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's a shaliach. Now. So on Rosh Hashanah, there is a decree about communities. They'll fall by the sword, they'll fall by the plague. Like we said, Alam Dinos Boye Omer, Ezel Acherev, Ezel Shalom. There might be an individual where it wasn't written about him that he's going to die by the sword, because that individual didn't have an avera that would have given him the death penalty. So therefore, that's why him running away from a certain locale where it was decreed that they will die by a plague or by the sword, he can save himself. He wasn't written that he was going to die in Rosh Hashanah. He remains on the capability of fulfilling his life. But if he stays in the city, he might lose that. Oh, let's say he follows the instructions of the doctors, where in the city of the plague is, that the doctors have also the ability to cure somebody from an illness. So that's why, even though there might be somebody, the community was declared to have a plague, the person, the yachid, might avoid that. Right? If there's a plague, run away. He closed his windows. The Mises Magefa, the Nisha B'chok HaEfshar. Because he wants to remain in the fact that he was granted a certain amount of life, he wants to keep that. So if it was decreed on Rosh Hashanah on every individual, and then if someone who was inscribed in the book of life doesn't have to protect himself, and the one who was inscribed for death, protecting himself will not help, then why do we see that Rava protected himself and instructed other people to flee? Obviously it was for a good reason. The Rashbash in the continuation also addresses the Gemara that one should not walk in the middle of the street during a plague. He explains that according to his interpretation, during times of health, a person must balance his conduct and take the middle approach concerning eating, drinking, clothing, and sleep. That's like the dogma of walking in the middle of the street. During times of epidemic, one should be extra careful, such as not eating too much, eating highly nutritious food, resting a lot, and like what Rabbi Kiva Eger mentioned 100 years later, because Rashbash was 100 years before. So a similar approach is taken by Rabbi Kiva Eger. Sefer Rabbeinu B'chai, Kosev B'posuk, Hi Badlu Mitocha Eidah, right? When Hashem was going to kill the Adas Korach, he told Klai Yisrael to get away from them. Now, Umash Yitzchak Loimer Hi Badlu. I mean, if those people were decreed to be in the book of life, then why did he have to say, go away from the Adas Korach? Kadosh Baruch Hu yesh b'yado lahamis la'achyos. Kadosh Baruch Hu can selectively decide who's going to live, who's going to die. He didn't need. Why did he have to tell those people to run away? He could have killed the Bnei Koirach or whoever was being killed there and leave the other people alive. That if 2 or 3 people cover themselves with one garment, and Ashnai Meitzav and say Nitzel, 2 of the people in the garment die and 1 saved, like 1,000 will fall. They don't. It was. They wanted to. Hashem wanted to separate the bad air from that he was going to bring on the Bnei Koirach from the people who were there. Or another reason he gives, like we said, that when Hashem makes a decree, then you don't, and a plague is going to come, he's not mavchin bein tzaddik l'rasha. So Rabbeinu B'chai explains that the righteous were required to distance themselves from the wicked in the story of Korach to avoid punishment from the natural consequences of the plague that later struck many others, which caused the air to contain dangerous particles, which apparently could strike the innocent as well. His second explanation, which focuses more on the spiritual aspect, is that once Hashem is allowed the Satan to punish, he doesn't necessarily distinguish between righteous and wicked, but will simply harm anyone in his path. Gemara Baba Kama supports the second idea mentioned by Rabbeinu Bachai. According to the Gemara, the reason that the Jews were not allowed to leave their homes overnight while making the Pesach Seder was because otherwise the Mashchis who was sent out to kill the Egyptian firstborn might kill the Jewish ones too, should they be found outside of their homes. Tani Rav Yosef, Maidich Siv, Atem Lo Seitzuz, Pesach Beisoad Boker, Kivan Shnitim Rishush Lamashchis, and Omavnim, Vitzedik L'Shoim. So this thing, where when Hashem makes a decree, doesn't differentiate between a tzaddik and a rasha, is even in the Gemara. The Gra quotes this Gemara as well, and elaborates in his typical concise form on the notion that even if one is not supposed to die yet, if one is in a situation or place of danger, one may be killed. Moshe Kazav Perik Vav de Baba Kama, Kivin Shnit and Rishus, Moshe Kazav Mishlei, Yesh Nisvev, Armin of Perkim of the Tainus, Ike Mutna Bechuzoi, right? This was a plague, and Ike Shirus, and there were caravans, Bosair. The Sham Ike Musna Bechaziri, and they became ill. Right? So he's just giving us the reference of the story where there the people ran away. And people run. So the Gra again says that you have to be careful no matter what, even if you're a tzaddik, and if you weren't supposed to deserve to die, you could be caught up. The clear message from these sources seems to be that one should not assume that proper precautions to avoid infection from a disease are unnecessary. One should not assume that one will become sick or die only if Hashem decrees it upon him, and otherwise he will be immune. Rather, the Rashbash, the Kiva Eger and the Gra, among others, inform us that one may indeed be harmed or harm others in places where a divine decree has been given for suffering or illness to occur. The same is true with regard to the coronavirus, where public gatherings and exposures to others in public places can potentially be harmful. One should follow the instructions and guidelines given by healthcare professionals completely to ensure that one stays safe. Moore's understanding the command for the Jews in Egypt to remain in their homes on the first Pesach night took on a special significance this past Pesach, where instructions given across the world were for everyone to remain in their homes as much as possible to avoid becoming infected by the coronavirus. Another extremely important point that has been pointed out widely in the medical realm as well as in the halachic realm is that this disease is more dangerous for certain individuals than others, especially the elderly and those with pre-existing health conditions. Thus, even if one chooses to expose oneself more than is recommended and assumes one's symptoms will be light or non-existent, which is the case with some, even if infected, one could simultaneously cause others who are more vulnerable to be infected. This is halachically problematic, as it's forbidden to cause damage or harm to others. So many poskim have recently cited a comment of Tosfos stating that one must be more careful with respect to the property and well-being of others than respect to one's own property or well-being. Says Tosfos in Baba Kama, Nira, the Yoser Yesh Lodem Lizar Atzmo Shlo Yazek Acherim Shlo Yuza. Person has to be more careful not to damage other people than to protect himself from damage. Tosfos offers his explanation as a solution to a difficulty raised in the case in the Mishnah of a cake taken by a dog together with a hot coal, which then ignited a nearby stack of grain belonging to someone else. So you have to be careful of damaging property of somebody else or damaging him more than damaging yourself. Based on this, we should attempt to minimize the risk to ourselves and others as much as possible, which in the current situation means limiting one's exposure to other people outside the house. And this is we have an opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of nishmartem ma'od v'nafsho seiseicha. What about medical professionals? A potential exception to the rule to not place oneself at risk in both the classical source as well as in our situation is the status of medical workers and health professionals. Since it's the job of such individuals to treat patients, in addition to the fact that they can help in the fight against the disease, many poskim hold that even if others should run away from an epidemic, doctors and medical workers are obligated to remain behind and treat the ill. This position has its basis in the Marshal, as cited by the Mogen Avram, who states that when the Shulchan Aruch declares that one who does not share in the suffering of the community will not merit to see their consolation, it refers to those who can help, but others should preferably stay out of danger. Shulchan Aruch kol hapoish min hatzibur ein aroim b'nacham hasom, So a person who is supposed to stay and doesn't stay will not see comfort. Says the Magen Avram, if a person has the ability to help save the community, whether with his body or his money, now, if he cannot make a difference because he doesn't have the knowledge or whatever, then he should run away. The Shevet HaLevi, Rav Wosner, applied this to medical workers in our day. He was asked a general question whether a doctor is required to treat a patient with an infectious disease. And if there was a plague. Or can the doctor also, is the doctor supposed to run away? Shuva, it's prohibited for the doctors to run away. They have to wear PPP and protective clothing, PPEs and protective clothing. They have to follow the guidelines how to stay safe with the infectious disease.
They don't have to give mouth-to-mouth resuscitation.
Well,
if they see a patient passing out.
Well, but today we use an Ambu bag. It's very rare that most places have
Yeah, but even then, you have to get so close to a patient. If you see a COVID patient that's really expiring, you have to get that close to him?
You have to intubate. The doctors intubate them.
Okay,
Sure.
I'm sure they're protected, yeah.
They're protected. If someone needs intubation, that's who intubates them, the doctors. So Sydney, in a patient with infectious disease, so you put gowns on, etc. And if he needs to be resuscitated, you resuscitate him in a way that you're not going to get sick. They would have an Ambu bag there. They wouldn't do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. They would use a mask.
Okay, but that's today. But you can imagine 100 years ago in the time of these.
Yeah. But they didn't know about mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. CPR is 50 years old. So he says, "V'rayali mitakonos Rabbeinu Akiva Yeager, v'shas magefa cholera, be'ir posen, shekosov shanashim v'cholim l'shamish ha'cholim ha'ele yeh ba'ofen kavua b'cheder a-latzaret." Right, latzaret is an infirmary. That he said they should be stationed. Doctors should be stationed in the infirmary because of shamshu schara nashim ha'ele. He hired people. I guess they had their own infirmary in Posen for the Jewish people. He hired them. And those people would call the doctor immediately. He didn't think he was referring to non-Jews. He thought he was referring to Jews as well. We will conclude by noting that aside from the important halachos and the issues discussed above, any global calamity of this magnitude is certainly an opportunity for additional tefillos, tshuva. Okay. And there's a summary on page 42 and 43 about what we learned tonight. I would continue to page 57. We're going to make a real attempt to, try to finish this book in the next 3 or 4 weeks, if we can. So 57. In the previous year, concerning the coronavirus, we discussed some of the halachic sources relating to the proper responses, both physical and spiritual, to an epidemic. In this year, we will focus on examining a selection of halachos related to a topic that has become relevant, davening in outside minyanim and at home without a minyan. Since shuls have been closed places over the past year, many people who are used to davening in shul are davening outside or in their home. So this is an opportune time to review halachos related to tefillah that are not always considered, as well as some of the new issues that have arisen as a result of the situation. So we will review one source that stresses the importance of davening with a minyan. The Rambam notes that tefillah b'tzibur has a more powerful effect than tefillah in private and is generally preferable. Says the Rambam, Hilchos Tefillah, Perek Ches, Halacha Aleph. Tefillah satzibur nishmas tamid. It's all when the public davens, it's always listened to. V'afilu hayeh behen choitim, and even if there's sinners in the group, ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu moyes b'tfilason shel rabim. Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't get upset with the davening of the public. Lefichach tzorch adam l'shatef atzmo matzibur, v'lo yispal b'yachid kol zman sheyach l'yispal matzibur. The Rambam clearly says it's much better to daven b'tzibur than b'yachidus. Unfortunately, over the past year, we have been unable to take advantage of the benefits of communal tefillah. Nevertheless, it would do well for us to remember that instead of viewing ourselves as being lenient on halachos of tefillah b'tzibur, we should view ourselves as having an opportunity to fulfill the halachos of pikuach nefesh, saving lives, and distancing from others to ensure no one is danger. Furthermore, we should be thankful that we are much better off than Jews were in earlier periods of Jewish history, where they were often forbidden to pray together due to anti-religious decrees rather than because of the value of human life. So what about porch and outdoor minyanim? Due to the dangers in davening in large groups, closing of shuls, many have organized minyanim outside in their yards or by joining together from their porches. Does the halacha permit or encourage organizing such minyanim in places and times where the local health guidelines allow for it? In this section, we will examine some of the rules concerning when individuals can join together to create a minyan, and whether they may do so even with some sort of separation in between. We should also emphasize at the outset that even those poskim who permit these minyanim in some situations agree that all participants must follow the local health guidelines.
That sounds so fucking creepy, but I love bitches.
And if they do not comply with the proper instructions, the minyanim may not be formed. One of the relevant sources can be found in the Mishnah in Gemara in Pesachim. The Mishnah states that if part of the Korban Pesach was taken outside of the area in which it was permitted to be eaten, because you could eat it anywhere in the city of Yerushalayim, that part, including the attached limb that was still inside the permitted area, is disqualified and must be disposed of. So let's say you schlepped the Korban Pesach to the limit, the border, the city limit of Yerushalayim, and let's say half of the Korban Pesach was dragged out and half is still in. So the half that was out has to be cut off. You can't eat that. The Gemara then applies the same rule to tefillah, that any individual who is not in the same room as the rest of the participating individuals may not be included as one of the 10 comprising the minyan. Rav Yeshua ben Levi disagrees and holds that since there is never any separation between us and Hashem concerning tefillah, the participants of a minyan may well join together, even if some of them are outside of the room. Right? Aver sheyatsa mikzoso, a limb that was dragged outside of Yerushalayim. You cut it off until you get to the bone. The kola, if you peel it back, until you get to the joint. Well, let's say you dragged a leg. So let's say you were in the mid-thigh. So you cut down to the mid-thigh and peel back the flesh above that, that's permitted. And you cut it off at the hip socket, because you're not allowed to cut through a bone. It says you're not allowed to break the bone of the Korban Pesach. Ve'etzem lo tishbruvo. And from the threshold to the inside is considered like the inside. The windows and the walls thickness are like inside. Says the Gemara. This still applies that one who's standing outside a doorway, he's considered outside. You can't count him for a minyan. But upligid Rav Yeshua ben Levi, afilu mechitza shel barzel, even if there's an iron wall between Hashem and us, eino mafsekas ben Yisrael ben Yisrael Shamayim. So the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch rule that concerning 10 men combining together to create a minyan, the halacha is in accordance with Rav that all of them must be in the same place. This is how Rashi understands the machlokas of the Gemara as referring to whether someone standing outside the door can count as one of the 10 of the minyanim. Tosfos understands this as referring to an additional person who is not one of the 10, but joining an already existing minyan. According to Tosfos, the halacha in this case actually follows Rav Yeshua ben Levi, that one may answer to a minyan even when it's outside. And that's actually the practical halacha. So if there's a minyan on the inside and the person's on the outside, he hears Kaddish, he can answer. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Tzar she'yikol asar b'makom echad, that all the 10 people have to be in one place. Ushliach tzibur imohem, the chazan has to be with him. If you're on the outside of the door, you're considered like outside. According to this, it would seem clear that if even just one of the 10 is standing outside in a different room or in a different area than the other 9, they cannot combine to create a minyan. However, there are a number of sources that indicate that there may be another factor that allows the creation of a minyan even in these cases, if they can see each other. The Shulchan Aruch cites this factor in the very next seif as a reason to be lenient in a case where someone is standing outside the shul peering in through the window, even if it's high up. If those in the shul can see him, then he can count as one of the 10. Misha omer achrei beis hakneset, somebody in the back of the shul. Ubeneim chalon, there's a window. Afilu gavoa kamakol, if it's a couple of stories. Afilu ein arach of arba, it's not 4 wide. Umar lem panav, and they can see his face through the window. According to this, if the person outside can see those inside, and they can see him, he can count for the minyan despite not being in the same physical space. Part of this approach is a similar halacha with an hilchos zimun, right, which is what we do before benching, where the Shulchan Aruch rules, based on the Rashba, that if 2 groups of people are eating a meal separately but can see each other, they can combine together in the same zimun, even if they are sitting in different rooms or different houses.
This is by the way, just a halakha l'maisa for all of us that daven occasionally at Shar Tefillah in the small minyan. It's an L shape, right? And sometimes the people on each of the L can't see each other. So as long as you have someone on the right angle of the L, right, where the Sfarim are, that can see both sides, then you can still count 10 men, even if they don't,
right,
both men don't see each other.
Many of the Achronim and commenters make reference to the Rashba as a source for the Shulchan. It is important to note that the Beis Yosef, this halacha is cited in the name of the Orchos Chaim and Rav Hai Gaon. Thus, even if one disagrees with the Rashba or the extension of the principle from Zimun to Tefillah, as some Achronim do, as we will see below, it seems that there were other Rishonim that subscribe to the idea of joining as long as you can see each other as well. This is a very interesting sugya which we're not through with. We're halfway through, and Mir Hashem, we will continue next week.
By the way, Rabbi Weiss also came out with his sefer on Corona this week.
Oh,
Shas and Shuvas Corona.
there's going to be a lot of Rav